Once again, we welcome you back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Harrison Griffiths to the show for the first time. Harrison is joining us from Britain. And Harrison, since this is our first time meeting you as a Young Voices contributor, I wonder, would you mind telling us just a bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I joined Young Voices for the spring intake last month. For my day job, I work as communications officer at the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is a free market think tank in the UK. Certainly been committed to the cause for a very long time. So this is a bit of a dream job for me, and getting to talk and write for a living about some of these important issues about individual liberty and freedom is a bit of a dream for me at this point. Well,
I recently just read an excellent article that you did for the American Spectator called "The British Free Speech Slippery Slope Has Become a Cliff." And I'll admit, I follow the news on Twitter, and that's probably where I get most of my international news. But I have seen a lot of people in the UK talk about how free speech is really becoming kind of a tricky thing there. Could you set the stage for us and just kind of tell us what is the situation and where does the danger begin?
Yeah, so for everybody in the States, free speech has become so much more of a live issue in the past few years, particularly when it comes to university campuses and things like social media platforms and social pressure. And they are important topics to deal with, absolutely. But I almost envy you in a way coming from over here, because you are fortunate enough to have the wise protection of your founding fathers, and James Madison in particular, on the First Amendment, which stops at least the government regulating the content of your speech. We, unfortunately, do not have that same legal protection. We do not have that same culture of free speech in our country. And over the last few years in particular, you've begun to see on the basis of hate speech laws, for example, the government really cracking down and using its full muscle and force to fine, imprison, put people on probation for literally what they say, the victimless, harmless crime of using your voice. And unfortunately, in the UK at the moment, it's becoming increasingly the case that the government has more control over your mind and your mouth than you, the individual, do.
Could you give us an example, for instance, of what that looks like? I mean, when we talk about hate speech, we're not talking about, someone just, threatening and menacing someone with their words, but what could pass muster as hate speech under some of the interpretations of these laws?
I mean, there's one example, I believe, from Liverpool, which is in the northwest of England, where a woman posted the lyrics to a rap on Facebook as a tribute to her friend who I believe had fallen ill. And the rap contained the N-word. And this was taken as grounds for the police to investigate her, to prosecute her. She was found guilty. She was put on probation. She had to wear an ankle tag for a period of time. She was under curfew. This is the type of stuff we are dealing with in the UK. And this is why I say, for all the trials and tribulations that free speech in America is going through at the moment, I really do envy the First Amendment.
Yeah, you point out in your article that the laws that were intended to prohibit people from harassing one another instead are being used to stifle unpopular opinions. Who gets the final say as to what's an unpopular opinion or not?
Well, this is the crux of my problem. The problem that I tried to illustrate in the article is that essentially that the final say goes to the state. There is no safeguard on that, and we know as classical liberals and libertarians that the question far more of, well, what ought to be done, the question that matters far more often is who decides. And in this case, you have a set of laws which are often very broadly written, which could encompass a sort of whole host of types of speech that are being put in place in order to ostensibly censor some of the types of language which are beyond the pale. And I, as a classical liberal, would say that even that is an overstep, but I can understand it more. But because these laws are broad, because it's the government who has the final say, you are asking self-interested politicians to draw the line between acceptable political speech and that type of speech that's beyond the pale. I believe that line is fundamentally illusory and can change very much over time. And so what you have when you give them that power to decide is, of course, they're going to say, if I believe in the right to an abortion, as I highlight in the article, that speech opposing that right or opposing the exercise of that right is akin to violence, because we've already established on far more reasonable grounds, really, that hate speech against somebody, say, for the colour of their skin, is beyond the pale, and the government has a role in policing that. And they look, therefore, to that precedent and say, well, we believe that all people should be equal regardless of their skin colour. That is correct. They look to the precedent that the government has been able to police speech which undermines that principle on slightly shakier ground. And so they apply that same reasoning to their chosen political topic of the day.
Wow. I mean, you mentioned in your article, and I remember seeing the video of this, of the police accosting a woman who was accused of silently praying outside an abortion clinic. And they asked her, were you praying? And I think her answer was something along the lines of, well, I might have been. And that was enough to arrest her.
Yeah. It's utterly staggering. I mean, the original grounds for arrest is that there was this buffer zone that was created by the Birmingham City Council around this abortion clinic. She had twice been found in breach of this and warned. But even so, the existence of the buffer zones in the first place is completely insane. And the fact that the third strike against her that led to her arrest was her stood within this buffer zone next to a street sign, literally with her head bowed, saying nothing. She was silently praying. It is an absolutely staggering indictment of where we've got to when it comes to free speech in the UK. And really, the debate that has occurred on this, it's not received an enormous amount of news coverage, but it's cut through a bit. The debate focuses around silent prayer. And that, I agree, is an important distinction to make. She was literally saying nothing. But nonetheless, even the framing of that debate is itself an indictment of where free speech has got to in the UK, because we should have the same outrage if she was shouting about it. But just the fact that even people who are campaigning on her behalf, which isn't very many, are talking about the outrage of silent prayer. Yeah, we're in a bad place when it comes to free speech. We really are.
It's astonishing to me, and I say this as someone who is very grateful, as you'd mentioned, for the limits on government power that we enjoy here in the States, thanks to the Bill of Rights, which springs from Enlightenment thinking, which actually had its birth there in the UK. And yet it seems like free speech is dissent generally. Any kind of dissent is under attack. Talk to me about what is being done and what are the prospects for either restoring or holding the line on free speech?
I'm afraid they're pretty minuscule. What's the buffer zone that was created, which led to the arrest of Isabel Vaughan Spruce in Birmingham, was created by the local council. Councils have some power to do this. The government is currently putting through Parliament the draft public order bill, and I believe Clause 9 of the public order bill creates these buffer zones nationwide. So if you are lucky enough to live in an area where the council hasn't already decided to deprive you of your right to speak against abortion, then you're out of luck now, because the government is going further and further, and there really does not seem to be a prospect of that changing. And part of that is because the only check, if such a thing even exists in the UK, on the power of our elected representatives to change the laws in these quite sinister ways is what people are willing to vote on at the ballot box. And not only is voting a bad way for people to express their preferences, literally one chance every so often to put one tick in one box, but it's also the case that the rich people are unfortunately not all that friendly to the principles that underpin the right to free speech. There is a lot of panic in this country about the impacts of the spoken word, and it's really sunken into our political culture that words can be violence, that words that distress people are a legitimate field which the government can use force to enter and fine and imprison people for.
Wow. To me, that seems such a daunting prospect. Number one, anybody, and we're seeing the bar lowered, anybody can find offense in almost anything. If I say, I think kittens are cute, I guarantee somebody out there is going to feel like, well, that's an attack against puppies or something. But to outsource to government,
I'm not a fan of cats.
What's that?
I'm not a fan of cats. So it's... I feel affronted by this. I feel distressed by this. You should be censored.
Yeah, it's to give government the final say as to what's appropriate and what isn't. What would it take to get people to think more clearly about maybe this is something we should be policing ourselves in terms of, how we speak up and what we're willing to tolerate versus let's let the government have the final say on what's right and what's wrong in terms of free speech?
I think really it's a broader shift in the popular view of what government is and what it should do. The free speech issue does not exist in a vacuum. It's part of a broader trend in this country where, for various reasons, people reflexively look to the state and they look to power and they look to force to create an environment in which their personal preferences are respected. And that is something we've got to change, whether it's about speech, whether it's about the economy, regulation, immigration, anything. There needs to be a massive sea change in the way, I would argue anyway, in the way that people perceive government.
Okay, we're talking with Harrison Griffiths. He is a contributor to Young Voices. Harrison, fantastic to catch up with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Very happy to welcome Emily Schroen. Emily, I've got to ask for clarification. Did I get your last name correct?
You did, yes.
Okay. Sure. A small victory for man, a great one for mankind. I just sometimes I have a tendency to overthink those things. Anyway, this is our first chance to hear from you as a Young Voices contributor. Before we dive into your excellent article on why South Korea should be taking notes from Ukraine, tell us just a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what you do.
Sure. So my name is Emily Schroen. I've been working in the nonprofit sphere for a while. And right now I've been working with an organization called Americans for Ukraine, helping support the Modlinska Humanitarian Aid Center in Warsaw, Poland. I've also been working with some IDPs in Ukraine and elsewhere. I have some former experience working out of Washington, D.C. with student programming. Yeah, okay. So that's what inspired my current work and writing is a lot of my experiences in Poland and elsewhere.
And I'm looking at an article that you wrote for the about the humanitarian crisis, not only in Ukraine, but how South Korea should be learning from what's been going on. It's been a year now, and you point out in your article that a year ago, Poland went from having very few refugees to becoming the world's second biggest refugee host. Now, I know you've actually spent time in Poland. Tell me a little bit about what that has meant to the people in Poland.
Right. It's a fascinating transition to witness, and it's actually more complicated than most people see on the surface, because actually Poland and Ukraine have a difficult history. There were some really tragic circumstances and during World War II that Ukrainians committed on the Poles. So to see the Polish really open up their doors to Ukrainians, it's not only a powerful testament to the international community, but it's also a really healing experience. And I think not only South Korea, but the world has a lot to learn from that. And of course, it hasn't been perfect. There's some fatigue and there's strain, but still the Polish community is standing strong and supporting its Ukrainian neighbors.
Now, and just can you give us an idea, when we talk about, there's been a huge influx of refugees, how many people are we talking roughly?
Well, some numbers say that over 18 million people have crossed the border.
Wow.
So that's not just into Poland, but you think Poland has been the primary border crossing for a lot of those people. About a little over 9 million just crossed the border into Poland. And then currently we're seeing about 1.5 registered refugees in Poland, but some numbers, put that much higher, considering those who haven't had an opportunity to register yet. And many others travel through Poland onto various other countries in Europe, the United States, Canada, Asia, and all over the world.
Well, there's no doubt that there is a huge humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, driving people across that border and to safer places where they can live their lives. Talk to me about what is happening in North Korea that should have South Korea paying attention to how Poland is handling this.
Of course. Yeah, North Korea has been an interest in the international community for a long time, and it's been flagged as a potential humanitarian disaster for many reasons. There's an oppressive regime. There's no political freedom. There's also right now a very striking hunger crisis, and actually Kim Jong-un just spoke on it this past week. and the fact that this is being addressed at all by the North Korean leader should have everyone's heads turning. What this essentially means is that the North Korea is facing the worst famine it's seen in a long time. And what that's bubbling is a humanitarian crisis that isn't entirely visible to the international community due to political restrictiveness and media restrictiveness. So even South Korea has acknowledged this presence, and some, including the former ambassador to Ukraine that I was fortunate to interview in that article, have said that this could be, a sudden catastrophic event where South Korea is experiencing a flood of refugees similar to what Poland has seen from Ukraine. And frankly, I don't think that they're ready.
Now, South Korea, what is their attitude toward refugees? Have they been accepting in the past?
Right. Regarding North Korean refugees, it's a bit of a different situation because North Koreans are considered Koreans. And so in the South Korean government and constitution, they are granted citizenship almost automatically. In regard to other refugees, though, they've strayed behind in their acceptance. And it's a famously homogenous country, similar to the way Poland was not too long ago. So all that being said, it's not impossible to change. And we've seen some strong strides in South Korea. They've been especially generous in giving to South Korean nationals with Ukrainian who are in Ukraine or who are connected with Ukraine. They're also an incredibly generous country and have been very supportive of humanitarian efforts. However, they still have a long way to go, and they rank as some of the lowest of the developed world in terms of accepting refugees.
Well, and you had mentioned, even though Poland and Ukraine had some bad blood, they were able to come to a point where Poland was able to say, let's put it behind us. Let's welcome these people coming across our border. Is that going to be more difficult given some of the hostility between North and South Korea?
Well, it's difficult to say, but frankly, I think if we've seen that it can happen in Poland and Ukraine, I think it can happen in North and South Korea. And I think that we've seen some good signs. Obviously, there's cultural differences with South Korea accepting North Koreans. There's, some discrimination like you see in any of these circumstances across the world. However, if under such a challenging circumstance up in Poland and Ukraine, I think it's very possible. And there's a lot of very kind, very dedicated and nonprofits that are currently working to help make this possible if needed.
Wow. So just finding housing for all the people that are coming over. Can you just shed some light on us? How do they accommodate, even temporarily? Let's just take Poland and Ukraine, for instance, with millions of people coming across the border. What kind of things do they have to be willing to consider in order to accommodate those people safely?
Of course. And at the beginning, especially, it was a scramble. And there are some pretty large refugee centers in Poland. One that I'm fortunate to work with is the Modlinska Humanitarian Aid Center. And there's another large one just outside of Warsaw where people can go immediately to get, a bed for the night. Some of these people walk 10 days, without basic resources to get across the border. We've seen tragic stories and intense just grief and travel. So some of these places are able to help people. And then also there's a program where many Polish citizens are hosting Ukrainians in their own homes, and the government is offering some minimal support for that. And also these shelters, people said there's some people who have been there since the start of the war, and we're working on building them into a more transitory place where people can find opportunities and create some stability in their own lives. But yes, the population of Warsaw alone, it was about 2 million, and now it's about 3 million. The population of that city increased by, about a third. So it's challenging and it's a strain, but I personally have been impressed by the Poles and their willingness to help their neighboring country.
Now, I've not been to Korea, so I'm speaking from a position of ignorance, but I have the perception that the population density is pretty tight in especially the more populous cities there in Korea. Does that pose a challenge, or is it a similar comparison to what the Poles were facing in welcoming refugees into their country?
It's possible, yes. And of course, dense cities face these challenges wherever you are. And if you see a sudden influx, that could certainly be a problem. However, I think that is something that Korea is going to have to think about moving forward, is about large movement of people, whether or not it be North Koreans or other immigrants that they're perhaps interested in getting involved with. So yes, the short answer is yes, this could be a problem. However, I think it's a workable problem. And we've definitely seen how the Polish have done it in Warsaw and other densely populated cities.
Well, as you point out in your article, they shouldn't have to reinvent the wheel if they're just paying attention to the things that are being done correctly, say, for instance, in Poland. And it'll be very interesting. You kind of put this on my radar screen now. I'll be keeping a much closer eye on what's happening between the Koreas, particularly in North Korea with that looming famine. Tell us, Emily, where can people follow you on social media? Where can they find your work?
Right. Well, you can find me on LinkedIn. You can also find my profile on the Young Voices page. My current article, the recent one, is on The Diplomat. So please look it up there, and you'll see more work from me soon.
Okay. Again, we're visiting with Young Voices contributor Emily Schroen. Emily, thank you so much. Let's talk again soon.
Thank you so much for having me, Brian. It's a pleasure.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome another new contributor to Young Voices. His name is Zack Vucurevich. And Zack, for those meeting you for the very first time, do us the honor of telling us just a little bit about who you are. What makes you tick?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a wildlife biologist, went to school at West Virginia University. I started my own company a while back called Whetstone Habitat. I do private lands consulting. It's working with landowners to come up, develop, and implement management practices for their property that are more sustainable, better for the native wildlife and plant communities to thrive. So it's a good excuse for me to travel around the country and tell people how to manage their properties. But it's a really fun job, and that's kind of what consumes all my time. I'm always doing something outdoors, whether hunting, fishing, consulting, hiking. That's my life.
Boy, I'll tell you, if your work takes you outside, especially hunting or fishing as part of it, I'd say that's a pretty good deal. Better than most.
It's a pretty sweet gig.
So I'm looking at the article that you wrote for realclearscience.com, and I'm reflecting back. I think it was about 30 years ago. I was sitting down watching Jurassic Park for the first time, and, the idea of, they're going to clone dinosaurs and going to bring them back and whatnot. But I have heard what I guess is some fairly serious talk in the last few years as technology has advanced that maybe we will see, the bringing back of some animals that were extinct. And I think specifically the woolly mammoth is one of those things that I've heard about. Talk to me about your article about 3 questions scientists should ask before they set about cloning a mammoth.
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea for this article kind of stemmed from a podcast interview I was listening to where conservation biologists were kind of talking about the plans moving forward and where the technology is at for making something like this happen. It's pretty incredible how far we've come since Jurassic Park to now. But I just had this strong feeling of I've been fascinated with the topic of de-extinction for a long time. And I just kind of felt like it was being misrepresented in the mainstream media as far as what is actually occurring with these animals. So, for instance, the woolly mammoth, yes, that's the carrot they dangle in front of everybody. And quite honestly, it's probably the most realistic, I would consider prehistoric beast we might be able to bring back. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One of the ones that stands out is it has a very close relative in the Asian elephant that could also be used as a surrogate for getting an actual mammoth from implantation to being born and hitting the ground. What I don't think was being properly represented is kind of the next step. What is that animal that's hitting the ground? Is it truly a woolly mammoth? The short answer to that is no. When you're looking at what's going on is they're taking all this ancient DNA from bone samples and tissue samples that are thawing out in the permafrost, and they're getting as much of it decoded as they possibly can, but it's still just a small fraction of that mammoth's complete genome. So what they're doing is they're looking at, okay, we have this Asian elephant who's a very close relative, and they're filling in all the gaps with Asian elephant DNA. So that animal that's hitting the ground, is it a woolly mammoth or is it a genetically modified Asian elephant? Did they just add hair and tusks, different tusks? And is that what's occurring here? It's something to jostle with. And on top of that is these elephants in particular, they spend a long time with their mothers and in learning the behaviors and characteristics and traits that make them an elephant. That's why they're so good at survival. They spend I think the average elephant will spend anywhere from 15 to 20 years with its mother before it's independent and on its own and sexually mature. That's a lot of time to learn those behaviors and how to act and behave. Like, it's a culture when you think about it. And there's no mammoths currently available to teach this new animal, whatever you want to call it, how to, fit in with the mammoth culture, if that makes any sense. So, it'll be interesting, and it's not to say you can't release something like that out there and it would inherently, figure some of those what foods it can eat, what foods it can't eat. It would figure that stuff out over time, but it's just something to consider when you're looking at these mammoth tasks, such as cloning a mammoth or bringing back other species.
Look at you. Raining down reality on our our fantasy of
there's nobody out there there's nobody out there that wants to see this happen more than me, trust me, but I just think we need to be realistic as far as what is occurring. When I look at something like this and how many resources are going into cloning a mammoth, that takes a big chunk of the pie out of some other genetic research that could be done that I think is much more applicable to what we're doing right now. What I really don't want to happen is seeing, let's say they do get a quote unquote mammoth to hit the ground here in the next couple of years. Now all of a sudden do we have an excuse to cut corners on our habitat work? If a species does go extinct, we can just bring it back. We did it with the mammoth. We can bring it back. And then what's the quality of life for these animals once they are born? Like they're talking about bringing back a dodo, which is all fine and dandy, but what are you going to do with this dodo? Is it just going to sit in an exhibit at the zoo? Yes, in theory, it's cool, but until you have a place to put them where they can act natural and kind of assimilate to fill the niche that they vacated years ago, which that niche may or may not even be existent anymore. Other animals have probably filled their niche over time. So if there's a reasonable place to put these animals and it makes sense, I'm all for it, but I just think there needs to be a little bit of foresight on the front end. Like I'm all for getting everybody hyped up and excited about it if it's bringing in donations, and that's great. But I think there's some better applications for these resources when I'm looking down the pike.
Yeah, you talk about some of the intangibles that have to be considered along with this. And, most of us are content to just skim along the surface. Oh, cool, a woolly mammoth, wow. But it gets complicated quickly when you consider, what it takes to sustain not just an animal, but a species. Will it have the right plants available? Will it have the right bacteria? And all of that. There's a lot of depth to the topic that I don't think most of us would consider.
Yeah, not to mention pathogens. You were talking about gut biome, gut health. There's so many things that we need to see, and we're not going to know until we get there. Is kind of the way I look at it, but we can prepare for some of those hiccups that might occur.
Are there groups that are against this? I'm just kind of wondering a lot. I'm People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, for instance. I could kind of imagine them maybe having a little bit of a problem with something like this, or would they be supportive of this kind of technology?
So I'm not sure what like PETA or the Humane Society or some of these organizations stance is on the topic of de-extinction. But just going off of people I've talked to in my day-to-day life, anyone from a barista to a friend's mom to just my day-to-day conversations with people. And it's really that morality of the whole thing. Is it ethical to be doing this? I think that's a very real question. Just because humans may or may not be responsible for a species leaving the face of the earth. Like let's use a dodo as an example. It's very like that is the first species where man realized we can make them go extinct. Are we obligated to bring that species back? Or is it kind of, do we just learn from it and move on and better protect the species we do have left? So Aldo Leopold, he's kind of the father of modern wildlife conservation. He talks about the most important aspect of being an intelligent tinkerer is keeping all the cogs and wheels, keeping all the parts. So just something to keep in mind as we're talking about these conservation issues and whether or not it's worth trying to save, some endangered butterfly or some plant species. You never know when we're going to need that. And then you never know 400 years down the line, are we going to be trying to scramble to genetically engineer a butterfly that went extinct under our watch? So there's, you can follow these trails in rabbit holes, and you can go a long ways, but there's some really cool stuff going on in science right now, especially in the world of conservation that I'm super excited about.
Zach, we've only got about a minute left here, but I have to ask this question. Extinction, and when animals go extinct, is it always because of humans or naturally? Are there species that basically outlive their usefulness and go extinct?
99.9% of all species that have ever lived have gone extinct. And that's looking at the entire span of the Earth's existence. Most species that have ever occurred on this planet have already gone extinct. Now, the rate at which extinctions are happening, that's where you can kind of get into the nuance. And yes, anthropogenic causes are kind of leaning heavily. And it's looking like we are the reason for a lot of these extinctions. But animals have and will go extinct, whether or not humans are here.
Okay. Thank you for assuaging my guilt, because I was really starting to feel some guilt there. I'm excited for what you're talking about here. I'm glad that there are voices of reason like your own that are saying, hey, let's move ahead, but let's do this in a smart way and ask the right questions. Zack, for people who want to follow your work or follow your writing, where can they find your work and where can they follow you on social media?
Yeah, so Instagram's my most social platform. It's at Whetstone Habitat, WHETSTONE Habitat. My website, whetstonehabitat.com. I'm on LinkedIn, Facebook. You can look me, Zack Vucurevich. I try to post as soon as my articles become public. I try posting them on my website, so there's pretty good aggregate there of some of my previous work.
Okay, I'm definitely going to be following because I want to be on top of topics like this one. Zack, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. This is our fourth and final segment today, and we're happy to welcome Young Voices contributor Finesse Moreno-Rivera. Going to be talking a little bit about homeless policy in New York City. And first of all, Finesse, for those who are meeting you for the first time, would you mind just giving us a little bit of background about who you are and what you do?
Hi, Brian. Thank you for having me today. I am a data analyst, specifically within the criminal justice field. I've worked with many different providers, such as the DC Police Department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Wonderful. Now, when I think about the problem of homelessness and I think about New York City, my first thought is, man, that must be an overwhelming issue to have to address. Bring us up to speed, if you would, on what exactly is New York City facing in terms of the homeless problem, and what are they doing about it? What could they be doing better?
Of course. Last year in November, Mayor Adams pitched a new policy, which I do believe has gone into effect, in that more homeless individuals will be hospitalized and will be having involuntary care provided to them if they are deemed to be having a psychiatric crisis. The issue with this is the fact that these individuals could be hospitalized despite the fact that they are presenting no dangers to themselves or others, and that police officers are often the ones who are making these decisions without the help of mental health professionals being on the scene.
Wow. Now, I know that there has been and I'm not saying New York City's done this, but there have been other areas, other metropolitan areas that have basically taken their homeless problem and tried to ship it, somewhere else, giving people bus tickets or whatever, trying to send them somewhere else, let it be somebody else's problem. In terms of numbers, is New York City, is it one of the biggest centers for having to deal with homelessness, or are there other areas that maybe even, are struggling with it more than New York?
Well, No, make no mistake, Mayor Adams has shipped some of their homeless population to other countries. I mean, we all are aware of LA's famous Skid Row and their homeless population as well. But as of right now, New York is looking at about 15,000 families who are homeless and about 24,000 homeless adults with 21,000 homeless children. If you think about it, unfortunately, you have to think about the children. In this case, if we have two parents who are homeless, who are hospitalized, what are going to happen with these children? And as we all know, that the New York foster care system is already strained as it is as well.
Wow. So when you talk about the mental health side, tell me a little bit about the criminal side, too. Do we sometimes blur the line between those two parts of the problem?
We do know that homeless individuals, they are 3 times more likely to have a mental health condition and 8 times more likely to report a drug use. However, there are no really reports or data to support the fact that they are more likely to be criminals than those who are sheltered. And so there's nothing to say that Adams' decisions for involuntary transportation could really be preventative to not cause harm to others who are sheltered or those who are just passerbyers throughout the homeless population of the community.
Wow. So where does the mayor turn for the primary help in dealing with the problem? Is it something that's being given to the police? Is it something that's being given to mental health professionals? Is there a better resource available that the mayor is not utilizing?
I believe that this is a more of a complex issue that shouldn't be one-dimensional. The mayor should be reaching out and working more with mental health care professionals. I think that he should be working definitely more with the education system. By that, I'm talking about experts that are more so in the field, thinking about this in a different light. I know California they're doing some great work with their homeless populations and figuring out what works best. There's a lot of data analysis out there, reports that have shown that shelter is the number one facet that is so important for those who need stability within their lives to really start out into being more part of society again, just having that stability. So shelter is number one. And really and truly what should be happening is taking all these empty buildings from the result of COVID and making them into more sustainable homes and just having that shelter for individuals within the homeless population. So really just looking at, from a contract standpoint and zoning standpoint as well, he could be doing a lot more when trying to look at housing for these individuals too.
Finesse, talk to me about how this problem can be addressed without compounding the problem through creating learned helplessness or dependence, basically on the state to provide those solutions. Or are there ways that immediate need for shelter can be met, but at the same time it's not creating a kind of a permanent shelter?
I think that if anything, there definitely needs to be more resources. Unfortunately, I think that New York right now is overwhelmed, as many facilities are throughout the country, because we just don't have enough workers at the front end, at the forefront. Especially with pay, you think about caseload with these individuals going out and trying to help and provide resources. We just don't have enough people on the front line being able to help without, experiencing burnout for themselves. So I really do think the more workers that we have out in the force, out there willing to help individuals get the resources that they need to get off their feet, I think that's what we need the most. Is really just making sure we have a very strong workforce there and just out on the streets and helping these individuals do what they need.
Talk to me a little bit about Mayor Adams. Is Mayor Adams' approach vastly different from how previous mayors have addressed this, or has this been an ongoing problem that other occupants of that office have had to deal with as well?
I think that his approach is different. I do believe that it's perpetuating the same cycle of hospitalization, letting someone go once they have a quote-unquote plan, and then just seeing someone back at the hospital because they don't have a sustained plan in place, but with that being said, there's also, some research out there as well that have seen individuals over longitudinal studies that have been given, the resources that they need, have been given a plan, have been given permanent, housing, and unfortunately have left their placement. So it also comes down to responsibilities and the want from an individual who does receive resources, who does put that stability within their life, to want to take what they're given and go for it. So, with that being said, we can only do so much. We have to meet an individual where they're at, and they want to be able to change. So, we can only do what we can do. But I will say with Mayor Adams and his approach and what he's doing right now, I think it's somewhat of just a Band-Aid. And I also think it's more of like a cleaning up the streets type of approach, too. As we know, there were a lot of different stories that are going on, a lot of different instances, unfortunately, with people being attacked on the subway as of recent. And so I really do think this is, just a different way of cleaning up the streets of New York for him, too.
Are there any other major cities in America that likewise are having to deal with this problem that, in your mind, are doing an exemplary job that maybe Mayor Adams could look to their example?
Again, I know that California is doing something a little bit different as of right now. We know that Skid Row is going to be Skid Row. Again, shelters are a huge thing. Building, these tiny homes. You see a lot of people who are volunteering to do that. But again, that's once again taking up space. And there's zoning issues with that. We also see that in Washington D.C. We see a lot of those issues. We see a lot of backlogs. So, to me, I think it's going to take a little bit more, I hate to use my own word, my own name, finessing when it comes to this, because there is not just one simple plan. And also, when you think about it too, I get that question a lot. Okay, well, can you give me an example? Can you give me an example? And it's like, not one plan, not one shoe fits all, because each city, each state is completely different, absolutely different. And so, to me, it's just going to have to, it's going to be a multifaceted workforce answer for Mayor Adams to have to figure that out, because even with this plan that he put forth, there's not even enough beds to support, this plan as it is. So I honestly don't know what this is, what it's going to take for the homeless population, but there has to be something else rather than overwhelming, our hospitals and our resources that are barely there, and individuals who are burnt out, and police officers who are not trained as it is.
Okay, very good. I really appreciate you shedding light on this. Again, we're talking with Finesse Moreno-Rivera, and could you please share with us, where can people follow your work? Where can they find you on social media?
Absolutely. So I can be followed at Finesse Moreno on Twitter, and then also I can be found Finesse Moreno-Rivera on LinkedIn.
Very good.
And
great to visit with you. Thank you so much. Let's talk again soon.
Okay, take care.